Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief Unstratified Entertainment. This is Andy and mine's odd solution to the question as to how we're going to talk about topical entertainment and media from month to month. And this month we have invited the wonderful Bill Farley. Hello, Bill.
Hello. Thank you both for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk about today's topic. But before we do, can you just introduce yourself, possibly?
Sure. I'm Bill Farley. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Southern Connecticut State University, which is a small regional state public university in the United States. And I specialize. My sort of day job, archaeology job, is I work locally in New England, in southern New England, particularly in Connecticut, especially on colonial sites, sites with Native American and European settler, mostly English, but also Dutch sort of sites from the 17th century and the 18th century. That's my sort of day job. But my night job, my after hours job, if you will, is trying to do some of this public science communication stuff that we're going to be talking about a bit today. And I do that through a YouTube channel called Archaeology Tube, where I talk about all sorts of archaeology topics, as well as archaeology in media, like on a show we're going to talk about in a minute, but also in games, movies, television shows, stuff like that. So check that out if you're interested in such things.
We always link to guests' websites and whatever below the line on the YouTube channel, so people will be able to look you up after hopefully they finish watching us talk this afternoon.
Exactly. Nice. Yes, I shall link below. I shall also, I haven't yet for some stupid reason, I'll also add you to my recommended channels, so I'll do that. Also, of course, folks at home, you'll know Andy as well. Hello, Andy.
Good evening, everybody. Hello, Bill. It's great to have you on the show.
Absolutely. Now, the reason why I say this is odd is that these episodes will be released in the month they're recorded for our Patreon supporters, and the month following, maybe a couple of weeks following, for people out there in general YouTube land. But hopefully, no matter when you're watching this, you find it interesting, because today we're going to be talking about Dum 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 Ancient Apocalypse. The series that someone asked for, and was made and was streamed and has been received in varying ways via Netflix. But interestingly, is not, I would say, just as a quick summary, it's not actually saying anything new. Interestingly enough, it's a show that has garnered a lot of conversation and discussion, not least from archaeologists and some members of the public, going back and forth on Twitter. This is actually how I first properly saw Bill, was his interactions on social media with some interesting people. I think it's worthwhile just before we go into actually what ancient apocalypse is, and we've got a few different key headlines here just to keep us on track for sort of different top aspects of this show as we proceed. But before we dive into those key sort of portions, I suppose the question is, this has been done before, and it's been done on British TV, and it's also been roundly debunked, hasn't it, Andy?
Right, just new viewer start here.
Yeah.
Back in 1999, the BBC made a documentary in a very prestigious science strand that the BBC ran at the time called Horizon. It was their mainstream BBC Two science program, and they ran a documentary about Graham Hancock's theory, which was then about 10 years old in publication. It was called, I think, Atlantis Reborn, if I remember correctly.
Not Stargate Atlantis, no.
No. This predated
Stargate.
Yeah. And to cut to the chase, it looked at primarily at Graham Hancock's theory, and is also his work with Beauval, and looked at things like the pyramids of Giza and the theory that the pyramids of Giza mirrored the belt of Orion. The program did things like point out that it mirrored the belt of Orion if you turn things upside down and reversed it.
Yeah.
So it basically it took a skeptical line. The result of that was that that Graham Hancock and Beauval complained to the BBC's regulator at the time, which was the Broadcasting Standards Commission,
Yeah.
on, I think there were 11 complaints altogether, and perhaps we'll come back to the upshot of those complaints later. But cliffhanger, it didn't end well for Graham Hancock.
No.
20 years on, ITN Productions, which is a British production company, are commissioned by Netflix, who the people pointed out the coincidence that Netflix's commissioning editor for Non-Scripted Factual is actually Graham Hancock's son. But ITN Productions, which is a perfectly legitimate British production company, and cards on the table, I've actually worked for them in the past. But they were commissioned to produce the series. The series went out just before Christmas. It first aired in November, and with the results that we are now seeing all across archaeological Twitterland and blogsphere. And hence we have Bill on as our guest this evening, or this afternoon in the States. Absolutely. So that's the background to the show. Perhaps new viewer has been fully briefed. Where are we at now?
And that's actually the reason why I didn't dive into watching it. I was quite late to it. I only watched it last week. Sat down, made my way through the 4 hours in more or less two big sittings. And what I find interesting about it is this element of it actually having nothing new to say, really. Having known previously what Hancock has been purporting and supporting and otherwise extolling, I wasn't surprised. But something that maybe Bill might want to come in on initially is I was struck by the style of the thing. It felt like it was stylistically presenting itself in a way that obviously, these days drone shots are very, very attractive and very easy to get. You don't have to hire a helicopter now to get these sorts of shots. But also as well, it had a sort of an early 2000s vibe for me. It had that sort of, every now and then, these sped up shots and whooshing around the presenter, around a site. It felt a bit sort of National Treasure / Ancient Aliens. What do you make of the style, Bill?
It's to try and stick to the brief, I went back and I rewatched about the first half hour this morning. I hadn't seen the show since when it first ran, and I was struck by how slick it is. It's very high production. It's very fancy. It's very high value, although it is really corny. I agree with this kind of with the spinning shots. And I was struck in that first half hour how much it is focused on the personality of Hancock. It really structures the show about, we've been dealing with this fallout of this us versus them notion of the show that archaeologists are secret keepers and hiders. And I think that's boiled right down into the structure and style of the show, that it centers Hancock, it centers his words about archaeologists, and it's sort of about him. And to your point about the kind of national treasure element of it, it's a adventure log. We're going to follow this man with a lovely British accent, not to this, I'm speaking from an American that has a lot of power to American Netflix audiences, right? He's got a very posh accent and he sounds very proper and cool. And he's going to take us on this journey around the world to all these amazing archaeological sites, which of course there's nothing wrong with that. No. In essence, that's the basis for so many great shows and could be the basis for many great shows about archaeology. But then, the things that he says are sort of bonkers. So stylistically, I was just having a conversation recently as well specifically about comparing it to Ancient Aliens. And it's interesting that you brought that up because I do think it's obviously taken some hints stylistically and structurally from Ancient Aliens, and in the way that it argues things and in the way that it uses subtlety and suggestion and conspiracy as ways to grab an audience and pull them in, obviously quite effectively. It's learned a lot from the Ancient Aliens, and yet it's also, I think, transcended Ancient Aliens in the sense that it is seeking a broader audience. They were, I think, with this show shooting for a group of people who are not conspiracy nuts, but are just people who are maybe a little bit interested in archaeology or just think this sort of stuff is neat, but they don't have any formal training in it. And so they can get blindsided by a lot of the things that Hancock says without having the critical knowledge, which is why I think all of this criticism that has been gushing forth from the archaeological community has largely been for the good, that people have been able to find places where they can at least get the perspective from others.
It's interesting that you say that about the British accent and the presentation. In that sense, he has that sort of. There's a reason why Brits are often Bond villains. That's sort of like, oh, he must know something. But also as well, I think there's an aspect there of his opening lines in the whole thing. The whole thing is the opening gambit is.
I don't claim to be an archaeologist or a scientist. I am a journalist, and the subject that I'm investigating is human prehistory.
I think if you look at it at its most basic level of storytelling, it's a quest story. Yeah. It's a quest story with Hancock as the hero and the archaeologists the bad guys.
Yeah.
And I know I'm always saying that archaeologists aren't always the good guys. They're for all sorts of reasons. But in this particular iteration, we're looking at an absolutely classical narrative and a classical narrative arc where the hero triumphs in the end by presenting his evidence against all the odds. And so it's at that level. Even just the beginning, it's a brilliant rhetorical device, as you say, because he sets himself up as a journalist. Therefore, we can't criticize him for doing bad archaeology. He's not doing archaeology. He's told us that. So he's just putting his point of view. Freedom of speech. He's absolutely entitled to do it, and none of us would argue with that.
No,
as a basic principle. Yeah. It's so. But also, it's absolutely controlled because darn well that he and the producers have scripted and created that moment to give the series that launch pad.
Yeah,
there's not an independent journalist sat in front of me asking the question, Graham Hancock, explain why you're here today, why you're here making this program.
Absolutely, and there are some specific, interesting callbacks to previous episodes that he makes, which are almost like sleights of hand. But we'll come back to that in just a moment. In terms of the content, then, what do we make of his choices about where he goes and how it's presented? Because I mean, you made a point, Bill, about this having had a premise of almost shooting for that audience, which isn't quite a History Channel devotee, but might be someone who has never heard of Hancock before. Almost like a travel show as well, partly, I guess. But what do we make of the way that these sites were chosen in terms of a premise, I guess? Because there is if you don't examine the rhetoric and the way that ideas are falsely connected, actually, but again, we'll come back to that in a second, the places do make sense. And also, it doesn't hurt that he's glow popping as well, so he gets to do that Nicolas Cage thing of going, "We need to go to Buckingham Palace," and sort of running off like. So, I mean, I'll hand over to Andy first, and then you, Bill. Sorry, go on, Andy.
Well, as Bill was saying earlier, in terms of the content, it struck me that there was nothing really new. There were it's pulling in the sort of the tropes that he's used before in his own work. He's using tropes that Scott Walters used in his work, which I'm sure Bill's very familiar with the bit working where he does in the States, with all the supposed interactions between the Knights Templar and Native Americans and so on that you get in absolutely standard pseudo archaeology. So he's pushing those buttons. And I think. Well,
sorry, and yet though he's not pushing the aliens button. Like that's what I was about to say.
Well,
I saw an interview with I think it might have been The Guardian. Was it? There was a journalist who had a chat with him, and he started complaining that ancient aliens had made a mockery of a very serious field of study. So I mean, that's in terms of that content. Do you think it's deliberately staying? I don't know what's the word in a realm where it's more likely to be accepted. Do you think?
I think so. I agree very much. with Andy that there's nothing new here in the sense that it's really, I mean, this is just his books being laid out there. And of course, we've all been yelled at for the criticism that many of his ideas can be routed all the way back to 19th century Atlantean stuff and Donnelly and stuff that's been connected very explicitly to racialized narratives. And that point, we've all been making that over and over again. But the important note here being that, I don't think he was trying to say anything new, but he was trying to speak to a new audience. And he knew this was going to give him a huge new platform, which it certainly did. So I actually think that was probably smart for him not to try and do new stuff. I do agree, going back to Marc, your question before about the style here. That does draw from Ancient Aliens again is that globe hopping thing. I think he sparkles the senses with jumping around these different sites. And you're right, a lot of the sites he's picked are fascinating, incredible sites. Obviously, he talks a lot about Göbekli Tepe, which is exactly the site you would want to think about if you're thinking about the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, from the pre-pottery Neolithic into later periods, into the emergence of symbol-laden communication and all this stuff. The reason archaeologists have been fascinated with this site for decades, he pretends like we've never heard of it. Which is a strange claim, because he's drawn all of his ideas from archaeologists and what they've found about the site. Absolutely, they're the right choices to pick, and all of that does lend to the credibility statement of his argument. He needs to lay out a level of credibility. I'm going to be talking about real archaeological sites. I'm going to be showing you the right kinds of archaeological sites, and then I will open up the door for you to accept the fact that everything I say about those sites is either outright untrue or shades of untruth, or taking a tiny kernel of truth and extrapolating it out. And the last thing I'll point out is it is amazing how important that first line that you pointed out was, I am not an archaeologist, I'm a journalist. I can't tell you of the thousands of comments I've gotten on the videos I've made about this show, and there have been thousands. Hundreds have been people saying he's not an archaeologist, he's just a journalist, so you can't criticize him in that way. Wow, did he put up a massive shield for himself there that was really successful with a lot of people.
Well, it was an attempt. It was an attempt. I mean, I know Andy has an opinion on that.
Although he says you can't criticize him as an archaeologist, he's a journalist. That's absolutely right. But that means you can then criticize him as a journalist. And it ain't very good journalism either.
No.
That's been my constant response is, but aren't journalists supposed to tell the truth? Isn't that the whole point of journalism? So he's okay. So he's not an archaeologist, but he's a bad journalist too. Right?
What's interesting here, though, and hopefully, if people are watching this and you're curious about this show, or you're wondering why archaeologists it's got the gander of archaeologists up, is for me there were a couple of moments, especially in the latter episodes, where he will literally say, this is what the sign for this site says. It is wrong, he'll say. It is wrong. I don't think I've ever once said Hancock is wrong. What I've said is his ideas are awful. His presentation is manipulative, and he's not attempting to disprove the hypothesis or to test the hypothesis. He has a story, and he's just telling it to us over and over again. And so in that sense, I think that in terms of content, it's interesting to me that it's set up using vernacular which is very understandable, no matter your level of education, no matter what age you are, even right, wrong. Theory, for example, is bandied around a lot. This is so and so's theory, as opposed to it being this is so and so's hypothesis or so and so's idea. The incorrect use of language, again, for a journalist is, I think, not accidental. I think it is all carefully laid caveats and things that he can hide behind. And when I say hide behind, again, I mean, rhetorically speaking, he can say, oh, well, I never actually claimed to be, or I never actually claimed that this, I'm just asking questions. So it's a form of globe hopping and introduction to archaeological sites that actually doesn't want to solve or answer any questions. What it wants to do is just present you with questions and then move quickly on to the next one. what if this was the case? Well, off we go. And I remember, and I'm sure both of you are the same. But certainly when I was first introduced to pseudoscience, not just pseudo-archaeology in university, this thing of building an argument on a house of cards was very important, because once you say a statement, so for example, my dog in the other room, he can understand quite a few words actually, and some dogs can understand, I think, more than 100 words, 112 words or something like that. Then you can go, well, given that that's the case, surely we can hypothesize, we can suggest that maybe dogs have written language. Now, if dogs have written language, then inevitably they're bound to have written some form of great epic storytelling. Now, of course, if we refer back to this written language that we agree exists, we can go looking for it. Now, when we go looking for it, humans don't like the fact that dogs write epic stories. So actually what's happened is that people like Homer, I think Homer was actually a dog actually. Homer was credited with writing the Iliad, and that's really quite horrible, isn't it? Now let's go over to this archaeological site. Schliemann discovered this place called Troy. This is where actually the Iliad took place, written by a dog, remember. See what I mean? You can, if you, without proving anything, you can take people along with you from what starts out as a fairly basic and actually, as you say, a grain of truth, kernel of evidence, or kernel of observable reality, i.e. dogs understand words, and just presume in your presentation that people agree with everything you're saying without you ever having to demonstrate anything. That's why I say it's disingenuous. I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm saying that he's not doing the work. He could be right, but he's not proved anything. That's the thing. So, for example, in the first episode, we go to a place in Indonesia, Gunung Padang, which he presents the archaeology of, 2 occupation layers, then gets a geologist to claim that there must be lower occupation layers, not quite sure how that works, dates that geology, and then... well, first of all, if you date the geology, that's a flawed technique. I think I said on Twitter, if you date the stones of Riddlan Castle from the 1230s, you're going to get a date of, 250 million years ago. So that's a bit dodgy. But then a couple of episodes later, or even the next episode, we'll say this place was built on this Mexican multi-layered pyramid was built on a sacred spring, just like the sacred spring that we saw in Indonesia. And you're like, hang on, what, you didn't mention a sacred spring when we were in Indonesia? What are you talking? But it's the sleight of hand, it's the moving on, it's the never quite stopping it's the sugar rush of mystery and intrigue, isn't it? As opposed to actually being satisfied with some just debate, discussion, and evidence. I mean, what are there any particular examples that come to your attention, Bill?
I think we can just run with the ones you just mentioned here a little bit, which is, he does this
Cholula.
technique.
He went to Cholula. Sorry.
Yeah. He going back to the Indonesian site. He does this a lot, where he never wants to outright just make something up. Like, he could just make up dates, right? He could just say, this is X number of thousands of years old. And yet he's flooding the zone with half truths, where, yes, to date the geology is, breathtakingly dishonest use of archaeological techniques. Mm-hmm. That is just, nobody would think that is reasonable to do in that circumstance, to date a geological stratum and pretend like it's a culture layer. And I've seen a lot of people say, well, radiocarbon dating isn't reliable because you're not dating the material, you're not dating the stones themselves. And it's like, no, well, we're oftentimes radiocarbon dating something that's a lot better than the stones. The stones are already millions or billions of years old before anybody decided to pick them up and build something out of them.
But even in places like Olduvai Gorge, where we do use geological dating techniques to date habitation layers, the geology has to be demonstrably associated with a habitation layer. It can't just be a rock that's 30 meters down and go, clearly someone was living there. You know, it as you say, it's disingenuous. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to.
Yeah. No, I really agree with that. Right. There's the archaeological dating and chronology is a complex science. It involves a mixture of geological principles, physical and chemical principles, anthropological, archaeological principles, understanding context, spatial context, temporal context. It takes archaeologists years to really get a grasp on how to properly date a site. It's hard. It's really hard. So to just, and so there's an oversimplification there of just throwing out numbers and saying, yeah, this is X number of years old. There's a reason archaeologists spend decades arguing about these dates sometimes, because it can be, there can be subjectivity and there can be challenge. And we're comfortable with that usually. At least archaeologists the last generation or two are quite comfortable with that subjectivity, with a recognition that we're not always going to perfectly know all of the answers. And what Hancock often does in this show is take that space for being unsure and tries to take advantage of that to create, well, then you really can't believe anything archaeologists say. And I've seen that a lot from Hancock's biggest fans in the last couple of months. Radiocarbon dating is not accurate in this circumstance, and you have to calibrate it for radiocarbon curves and et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, none of it's real. You're all just writing, you're just making up stories. It's like, well, no. I don't think that that's fair. I think that that's really unfair. While all archaeologists will recognize that narrative building is a part of what we do, and yes, we do have to fill in logical gaps in the story because we don't have time machines, and even if we did have a time machine, we probably still would have to do that because that's how studying humans works. So. Anyway,
you know, I once had a conversation with someone who said the best way to study people and not have even generation to generation observational weirdness come in is just to freeze thaw anthropologists through time. So you get someone to make some observations, freeze them for 50 years, and then bring them out again. And even then, you're going to get some observational bias coming in. So go on, Andy. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to pick up the idea of context, but I wanted to move us on really to talk about cultural context, and it's something I know Bill's talked about in his responses to I almost called it Ancient Aliens for a moment. Ancient Apocalypse. Is the title deliberately alluding to Ancient Aliens?
I think so. Yeah,
I think so too.
What, you mean that show that's had 20 plus seasons? Why would they want to be associated with that?
Anyway, no. One of the most striking sequences in all the programs for me was when the crew rocks up outside the Serpent Mound in Ohio.
Yeah.
And Hancock does a piece to camera explaining how the management of the Serpent Mound in Ohio have refused permission to film within the monument. And it is presented as part of the archaeological conspiracy. Now, I know because I've read around it and I've also watched Bill's videos that there's actually cultural context to that refusal, which he is completely ignoring. And I think, again, it might be valuable. Could you just fill in exactly what appears to be the reason that decision was made? Because on the face of it, it is a PR disaster because it does play to the conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I think he is intentionally covering over a lot of complex decision making there, and he's suggesting that. I mean, first off, it's ridiculous that archaeologists denied him access to this site. Like somebody picked up a big red phone that called the Society for American Archaeology, and the executive board got together and voted to vote him. It's ridiculous, right? That's silly, right? Archaeologists did not make that decision.
Do you know? So just very, 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 very quickly, the number of times I see people walking on Hadrian's Wall, and I wish I had the power to say, "Get off the stones."
We can't stop people from doing anything. We can't stop people from doing anything. But it is washing over the fact of decades, centuries of the complex relationship between archaeologists and native communities. And I don't know the exact reason why. I mean, I read the letter like everybody did, and Hancock doxed that poor person on the internet, who was in this letter telling him he couldn't do there. But it wasn't 100% clear exactly why. But I suspect Serpent Mound, like many sites like that, is a really important spiritual place to indigenous people, to certain groups of indigenous people. And something that has changed for the better in the last couple of decades is that places like that now make decisions based on a broader a stakeholder set than they used to. Oftentimes, and that may be the case here, Native tribes actually get a say. They go and maybe the say in whether or not they're going to allow any kind of filming on a site or any kind of analysis on a site that might be destructive. There is a open and sometimes intense communication about those sorts of things. And so he sometimes in that very episode, he makes an argument that, he's really the defender of Native American rights. He's really the one. Archaeologists have been terrible to indigenous people. And so he's the one who's going to protect indigenous people. And you know what? Again, kernels of truth. He's right. Archaeologists have a horrible, horrific history of abusing indigenous people and using their literal bodies at times to make their careers. And we have been engaged in a very serious ethical debate about that for a long time now. And places like Serpent Mound and its communities having the power to say, I don't want somebody to come and film here on this sacred place is an important part of that solution. It is an important part of respecting the rights and the beliefs and the desires of the same indigenous people that Hancock is claiming to protect here. So I think that that's really disingenuous again, in my opinion. So.
When I was doing the prep for this chat, I came across an article in the Columbus Free Press, which is one of the local news outlets for the region of the Serpent Mound, and they point out, for example, that in 2012, a New Age group actually buried some sort of New Age mineral machines on the site. They co-opted it for their own purpose. The article calls them as a Scientology-like group, a cultish group. But also, the article alleges that, for example, the management had got into a lot of received a lot of bad press after they cooperated with the recording of episodes of Ancient Aliens, and that they now don't cooperate unless they're given basically a right of edit.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting that in that sense, what we see a lot of here, ironically enough, is well, as I say, two thoughts come to mind. First of all, there's the irony of someone who says, you guys who've been studying, you guys and gals and everyone else who've been studying this stuff for 100 and more years, hundreds of years, you've got no idea what you're looking at. I have the answer. I have the answer. That me. But then the second thought that comes to mind is, but which strand of pseudo-archaeology is the correct one? Because lots of the people who will join Hancock on speaking tours, at great expense, I might add, to go and see them, or, for example, people who have localistic, nationalistic ideas. For example, the Bosnian pyramid is something that I've talked about before on my YouTube channel. Don't fit into this globe-spanning notion of an Ice Age culture, and yet they have just as strong certainly a publicly held fervent assertion that they are correct, even if who knows what they think privately. Certainly publicly, and often they are able to get lovely, very accessible books published, and for example, in Bosnia, there's a whole portion of money dedicated to a national park that's sprung up around these pyramids, so-called, even though they're mountains. I suppose the question is, who are we to trust then? Because in that sense, if we just open the door to pseudo-archaeology and all of these people with all of these ideas are to be all taken seriously at the same time, are we actually looking at a sort of a post-truth, pick your facts, alternative facts kind of a notion here? Because it's clear that Hancock himself does not like ancient aliens theories, and clearly, well, presumably, doesn't necessarily like too many other people's ideas either.
Can I just say on that, Mark? Me think the man doth protest too much, because if you look at his published oeuvre back in the 1990s, he was publishing books talking about the Martian Sphinx and so on and so forth. Yeah, he uses the A word.
I wrote a whole book about it. He did.
Yeah, exactly.
So why? Okay. Right.
But leaving space for change. Perhaps since writing that book, he has decided. I'll give him that space, right? Maybe he has decided in the last a couple of decades that I was wrong about that. I don't think I've ever heard Hancock say he was wrong about anything, but maybe he's distancing himself from that, and he's saying, okay, I don't believe those things anymore, and that could be fine if he wants to do that.
What's your thought on, for example, there is a line of thought, a line of strategy in public relations, whereby if you have a story that is negative towards you, you never deny, you don't apologize, you don't explain, you just keep absolutely stum, and it eventually goes away because the media moves on to something else. And would archaeology be better if that had been the approach that had been taken, say, by the SAA, rather than writing that letter, or is that dangerous in your view?
So I'm gonna be an absolute coward and play both sides on this question, because I don't know, and this has emerged. We were chatting about this before we started recording. So and this is I don't know, dear audience, this is an evergreen discussion. You might be watching this in years, but in the last couple of days, the discussion has started to percolate up again, because there is supposedly in a few months' time going to be a great debate on the Joe Rogan experience between our very own Flint Dibble, our very own Flint Dibble, archaeologist extraordinaire, and who I consider a friend and acquaintance, and Graham, and I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but it has risen up this exact question again of, are we better to simply ignore these guys and just wait for them to blow their wind out and move on, or do we meet them on the field of battle and fight them and blah blah blah? And the answer is, I don't know. I think the evidence on that is out. I do think there's been some really interesting research that has suggested that in the past decades, oftentimes the ignore them and they'll go away thing worked pretty well, because the way that information was passed out was through media sources that had editorial structures in place. Nowadays, because you've got the Joe Rogan experience with X number of millions of listeners every week who is going to put Hancock on a show over and over again, and you've got YouTube channels with millions of subscribers compared to our YouTube videos with our paltry thousands. We are folks have a megaphone all the time, and they can speak whenever they want, and people are going to listen. And I don't know for sure whether that means that the calculus has changed and it is better now for us to speak out. But I am willing to admit that I do think that I think that the ground is different than it was maybe 20, even 10 years ago, but certainly 20 or 30 years ago, because of social media, because of people having access to things like YouTube, podcasts, and just being able to build massive audiences without needing to get on BBC or NPR or anywhere else at all. So
now I'm eager to get on to a couple of specifics, just because I know some people watching this will be going, you actually haven't addressed any of his ideas necessarily.
Fair enough.
But just before we do that, though, I suppose I'll flip that question on its head, this idea of whether you meet people in battle on the field. I suppose flipping it on its head and taking other voices, as archaeologists always have had to, actually, in many cases, or certainly in some cases necessarily have had to be forced to. The question of plurality comes in. What is the limit of plurality? So, for example, again, I live on Hadrian's Wall, although I don't walk on it, as we've established. And here we have a solid monument, a landscape context, also partly monumental in its own right. But we also have hundreds of years of people living in that landscape, all having their own stories, their own interactions, their own folk memories, and occasionally demonstrably incorrect notions, or demonstrably not possible notions in terms of the physicality of the place, but nonetheless have a sort of an intangible quality, a sort of a cultural value that increasingly over the years archaeologists have actually attached to Hadrian's Wall. They have said, here is apparently a hole where a witch was burned to death, or something like that. when there's no proof of that at all, there's no burning, the hole isn't big enough for a person, all that kind of thing. What is the limit of plurality? I mean, I'll ask you both that. I mean, who wants to go first?
Bill, you go.
Yeah, I think this is so hyper important, and you're right. We have been making space in archaeology for a long time now for all the voices of people who want to speak and people who might be bringing different perspectives, with a recognition that some of those perspectives might not be materialist. They may not be scientifically falsifiable. And one of the criticisms I've had of Hancock's work in general is that I believe Hancock's ideas are largely spiritual in nature, right? He is making a quasi-religious argument about our connection to the past, about our shared humanity and connection to certain aspects of the world, water and life force, and stars, right? The stars, the heavens, and a lot of his work in the past has been about that, about our shared spiritual connections. And, I'm okay for making space for spiritual interpretations, religious interpretations. That has always been a place where people can say they think those are not scientific approaches. They're not falsifiable. We're never going to be able to test them in that way. But we've been doing that forever, right? There's the human evolution interpretation, and there are many religious interpretations of where we came from. Where did humans come from? Where were we born? Do we have higher powers? Is there life after death? We have scientific explanations and we have non-scientific explanations. And those things have lived sometimes uncomfortably side by side for centuries, millennia, forever, for as long as we've been asking these sorts of questions. The problem with Hancock here is that he is demanding that we accept these from a scientific perspective as well as a spiritual one. And that's, he actively is mad at us because we're not accepting that he's decided he wants to put a scientific spin on these things. So, that's, I don't even know if that answers the question, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot in the last few months, and exploring more of Hancock's literature and oeuvre, as we used before. I like that word. A lot of it is coming from a quite explicitly spiritual angle. So how are we supposed to question that as scientists? I don't know.
Well, I think that's I'll hand over to you in a second, Andy. So, but it occurs to me that in that sense, I have no problem with even this idea of sort of a pan-continental view of humanity. We are all in that sense related, and so I think there's some interesting things there. But actually, evolutionary anthropology does an awful lot of that work already. Doesn't require you to make things up to link us all. Sorry, Andy, go ahead.
What I was going to say was just on Hancock and spirituality. I think it's a really interesting angle. He actually, as much as a pseudo-archaeologist, he's also a New Ager. He's talked a lot, and in fact, he did you can still find it out there online. He did a TEDx talk about his drug use. He said that for 20 years or so, he was a very heavy cannabis user, but he's now switched to the Amazonian shaman's favorite, ayahuasca, which is a natural hallucinogen. And, people travel from Europe and the States and so on to go to visit shaman in the Amazonian jungle and partake of these ceremonies and so on. And they're absolutely entitled to do that. People find their spirituality in all sorts of different ways. So that there is an underlying strata of this, I think, in Hancock's Hancock's work. But I think there's another thing which, again, I regard myself these days more as an archaeologist than a journalist, more as a journalist than an archaeologist. I've said that in the past. And if you approach Hancock as a journalist and you ask about motivation, and you look at what not just Hancock, but other people who work in pseudo-archaeology do, and you ask the classic question, cui bono, who benefits? If you think about it, Giorgio Tsoukalos was just somebody with a BA in comms and an interest in promoting bodybuilding.
Yeah.
Until he got into Ancient Aliens.
Yeah.
And now he's an international meme.
Yeah.
Hancock's first major work was a book about the interaction between the United Nations and the aid community and the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia, where he was the Economist's East Africa correspondent. You know, he was a respected journalist. But while he was there, he appears to have found the story of the Ark of the Covenant being held, kept in a church in Ethiopia, where the Queen of Sheba came from, and all the rest of it. But that was a single one-off legend that he wrote about, and then he discovered that actually he could create. You can argue that he could create this entire mythos that stretches all the way around the world, and you could write about endlessly.
Yeah.
And there's an audience for it. Now, nothing wrong with that. We all want an audience for our work. We all have to earn a living.
Yeah.
But I think, I think we can be too precious about this stuff sometimes. And
in that sense, it's interesting because he certainly can turn a phrase. He knows how to describe places, and in that sense, it is good writing. But it's also lacking on specifics, and in fact, in that sense, never quite landing on specifics means that actually you can invite other people who write, for example, about the astronomy of temples on Malta into your theorem or into your hypothesis quite easily. That, for example, the temples on Malta were all pointing at the Sirius star at different times in its lifetime. If you look at the range of places to which the temples on Malta are pointing that they highlight in the show, even the precession of the Earth doesn't cover that much space within say 6,000 years. I mean, it's interesting how often scientific language can be sort of co-opted and used to befuddle and bemuse people. But let's start with a simple one. When was the end of the last ice age?
Well, it depends on whereabouts in the world you're looking from.
Okay. Yeah.
12 to 15-ish thousand years ago ish.
So ballpark, northern hemisphere, northern Europe,
ballpark. Yeah, it depends again, right? It really depends on where you're talking about, and I think that thinking about this at a global scale is not particularly useful if we're thinking about a particular population of people. If we want to talk about some Clovis technology user person in North Dakota versus modern day versus a person living at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, present day, they probably experienced the same year very, very, very differently and in a given place. So I agree with that. I think it really depends.
Very differently. Yeah. So it wasn't a single cataclysmic. He loved that word, didn't he? Event. Okay, what about sea level rise? Does anyone want to have a guess at how quickly sea level rose on average? Let's say per year.
But again, it's cyclical. I mean, I've got the River Thames just down at the bottom of the hill from me, and the sea level in East London rose between the beginning of the Roman period and the end of the Roman period. The Roman port of London migrated downriver a mile or so because of the change in the tidal line.
But with the melting of ice, this massive water being quote unquote dumped into the oceans, how quickly did the sea rise per year? Just throw out a ballpark figure.
It's pretty slow. It's a
centimeter per year.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's something in that neighborhood. It's right.
Yeah. Maybe a meter per century.
Not quite the gigantic tidal wave of 90s destruction movies that I think that Hancock is implying.
Yeah. And the fact that the clouds swirling and changing color, the lightning, the tsunamis, this kind of thing.
But again, this is the other thing that people forget about Hancock. He bought into the whole Mayan Prophecy 2012 thing.
Yeah.
And then when it didn't happen, that quietly gets shelved.
Yeah. No, exactly. Okay, how about the fact that archaeologists are slow to and refuse to look at various archaeological sites around the world? Have you ever turned down work
I mean, I've talked about this a lot, probably more than anything else, but this is the most, if you're an archaeologist, is the most fundamentally ridiculous claim that we hear in this show and that we keep getting criticized for. This idea that archaeologists would choose to hide incredible findings, a massive globe spanning civilization that existed during the Pleistocene. We would hide this for quote unquote reasons. And people keep saying, oh, it's because of grant funding. You want to protect your grant funding. Do you know how grants work? Do you know how many do you know how much millions of dollars people would pour on top of me if I had a single Atlantean artifact in my laboratory that I could make oh my God, it would make your career and the career of everybody you've ever met. It would be insane. So that's nuts. It's nuts that this has been that this has become a narrative that we are somehow trying to, and this is the place perhaps where the show gets most conspiratorial. Actually, more than anything else, is this idea that there truly is some idea of a collaboration of archaeologists who are hiding the truth. Quote, the truth. They, quote, are hiding the truth. What are we supposedly hiding? Are you not? We take the most boring archaeological finds and try and convince people they're the most important thing that's ever been found in the continent where you happen to work. So I don't know if I buy that argument so much.
Well, and this, I suppose, going because people often, I've seen in lots of comments on different videos talking about this, they immediately say, have you talked about Göbekli Tepe yet? Have you talked about the one that shouldn't exist yet? And something I find fascinating about that is the way that Hancock simultaneously says that well, first of all, there's at some point in the series, I forgot which episode it was, there was a misuse of the notion of anatomically modern humans. Basically, all the people living at any of the times that he's talking about are all anatomically modern humans. Stone Age hunter-gatherers were anatomically modern humans. But also there's this weird thing of simultaneously saying that people back then could not possibly have done this, but then on the other hand saying that very quickly they were deployed to do this. You can't really have it both ways, in so much as people would have clearly had language to talk. Even if you believe that someone came in from another society that had just been catastrophically flooded for reasons, the people that they met would have had the capacity for art, for language, for construction, for incipient farming, and actually what we see in the area around monuments like that in Anatolia and through the rest of the Near East is this experimentation. It happened slowly and over time. And I suppose, just as, for example, people used to say, how did they build Stonehenge? How could they possibly have done that when they were just, early farmers? In this instance, it's a very similar trope. But I suppose the point being is part of the reason why this doesn't have, archaeological narratives don't have the same sort of cut through, is that they are slow. Seas rise very slowly. People experiment and fail with farming and with pottery and with so on and so forth over and over again before one of them happens to work or happens to take culturally set fire, as it were, to people's imaginations, and then suddenly people are doing farming en masse. Is that the problem? Is it actually the fact that the human story isn't a movie?
I think this is a huge part of it. I think that people are really bad, and I don't blame them for this. I think actually archaeologists are pretty bad at this too. It requires you to think really hard to the point where you get a headache. That it's really easy to crush down timelines. It's really hard to contemplate how long 1,000 years is, or 5,000 years is. That is a tremendous amount of time. And it's really easy to simply say, well, yes, the sea levels rose very quickly. Sure, they did. They did rise very quickly, comparatively speaking. But you're still talking about a centimeter a year. That is a degree at which maybe people would have noticed it over the course of their lifetime. And certainly people would have noticed it over the course of their lifetime, plus their parents and their grandparents' lifetime. But they would have noticed it. It would not have washed them. Yes, it would not have washed them out to sea. It would not have destroyed a huge global civilization. But it's hard. That's a really hard thing to wrap your head around. And we have been trained by every movie we've ever watched and book we've ever read and video game we've ever played to think about time in a compressed way. All right. But if we put ourselves in the shoes of a person in the past, living one lifespan as a part of a 1,000-year trend, it is it just would not have the impact that they're talking about. And I think with this question of how do these people just suddenly learn to do this? So going back to Göbekli Tepe is a great example, right? How did they? Well, first of all, they didn't suddenly learn how to do it. We actually have a pretty good timeline of how people went from not building these sorts of sites to building these sorts of sites, and we can sort of track it. But at the same time, when the biggest thing that really angers people is when archaeologists talk about race or white supremacy, right? Heaven forbid we say those words, white supremacy. But this is where that comes from, right? What Hancock is proposing is that there were people in the past who could do it and people in the past who couldn't. And what separates those people? What's the difference between the wizards or whatever he calls them from the Ice Age civilization and Atlantis and the dumb hunter-gatherers that he sort of proposes who learn from them? What separates them? I don't know. Right? He leaves that unsaid. He leaves that subtle. And that's the thing that I think.
But he does go out of his way to mention beards.
Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah. No, there's whistles in there, and we know from some of his books that there have been times when he has been less careful about how he has phrased this and structured this. And again, maybe he's learned. Maybe he doesn't really believe that this is an ancient white race, but he is building on the backs of people who have been saying that for the last couple of 100 years. So,
well, it's interesting. He definitely in the series he definitely went out of his way to say actually maybe Native Americans also had. We're also observing the night sky as well, which is very gracious of him, I suppose. But but yet at the same time as well, there are parts where when he's writing, when he's waxing lyrical, when he says humans have always looked to the night sky, and he laments the loss of the night sky in cityscapes. And I agree with him. I've had some wonderful experiences out in the mountains, away from the city lights, and it is transcendent. It is beautiful. It is something that humans have often, especially in urban areas, slightly let go of. But it doesn't mean that there's an ancient civilization that was specifically targeted by a very slow rising sea, just chasing them through the earth. So, what is the harm? That's my big question here. Really, is what is actually the harm in Hancock having his slightly nepotistic place on Netflix being exposed to millions of people
allegedly.
Sorry, yeah. Underscore heavy print. And having a story out there. We don't say that J.R.R. Tolkien has abused history and heritage by drawing on very real world stuff and presenting an alternative vision of a history or a time and a thing that he loves. We don't necessarily even mock colleagues who hold on to very, very niche things that they really want desperately to be true, borderline to the point of, as I say, not wanting to see their hypothesis disproved, which incidentally actually is also an accusation that's often levied at our academic colleagues. Is that I've seen it said many times, especially on the Archaeosoup Facebook page, where people say the pace of change in academia is so slow because you have to wait for the last professor to die before their ideas can be overthrown. I don't think that's true. I think that's someone saying that, possibly based on some parts of Europe. Certainly, I mean, Italian academia can be very reverential to those who've gone before. I know that, but what is the harm in having someone out there with a weird idea that's sure unprovable? A lot of stuff is unprovable. Doesn't mean we don't talk about it.
Yeah. Can I throw one thought into this before we open it out a bit?
Yeah.
Asking that question, what is the harm? I think there's a very particular situation we're in at the moment, and it's been developing over the last couple of decades since really the growth of the Tea Party in the States, which is this idea of post-truth. It's here in Britain as well, and it's where certain political groups, usually but not exclusively on the right, weaponize culture in the quote culture war, and part of the culture war is about removing the voice of expertise. And because some of the political movements, some of the political theories that we're now living with the consequences of, don't stand up to scrutiny. In the UK, Brexit is the obvious one, because by all objective standards, it's a disaster. But it's been so bought into by certain groups of the country and the political class and the media class that you're not allowed to question it.
Well, but also I think it becomes so personal. It's such a personal investment. Yes, it's really hard. It's painful to say that you're wrong on some of these things as well.
Yeah, and I think that atmosphere, that ethos it's a miasma that's spreading over society, it's spreading over culture, and it is now. In fact, it's part of the atmosphere that archaeology has to exist within.
Okay, interesting. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I would say my answer is similar in a lot of ways, and I even had but I think it's a two-part. I think it's a two-part problem. I don't think it's so simple as saying, "Oh, this just straight up like supports racism," although I think it can, and that's part of it. We should note that, right? The connections to a history of white supremacy is in this theory is something we need to be concerned about. But I want to build a little bit on what Andy said too, in that I do think that this contributes to that notion of a post-truth, anti-intellectual, anti-expert notion of that those are that it is a good thing to only believe your gut and yourself and what I tell you, and also maybe buy some of my pills that will make you more manly. Right? That
who can you possibly be referring
to? Who could that mean?
Hang on, don't buy his pills. Buy my pills.
Yeah, exactly. They're the same. They're the exact same pills. We got to buy them from my website. So but the second part of that is it adds to that environment, which is very uncomfortable for us as scholars and thinkers and people who want to think deeply about things and want to be critical thinkers. But it also becomes a pipeline to conspiracy and to conspiracy theories. And there's been some really good research that has shown, for instance, the connection between flat Earth theory and QAnon. There was a like a direct route from people who believed in flat Earth, a similarly who cares, just kind of quacko, a weirdo belief that it's obvious and easy to prove that that's not true, but whatever. People just want to have their flat Earth societies. Let them do it. And that may be true, except that became breeding grounds for the sort of folks who became big QAnon people, right? And QAnon and conspiracy theory places like that are legitimately dangerous. They do tear at the fabric of society. They do threaten violence. They do want to destroy a lot of things, right? So that is, I think, the thing that makes me nervous about it. And it's a couple of steps down. And are we going to get accused of, oh, you're just arguing about a slippery slope? I guess, but I think that it's been shown in other anti-intellectual conspiracy circles that slippery slope was there. So why should we expect that it's going to be any different with this stuff? I don't know. I don't know why it would be.
Well, it's. I mean, I haven't got any. I can't prove it. Oh no, I'm doing it. No, I haven't got any direct evidence or numbers for this, but it is interesting to note the popularity of, for example, Ancient Aliens, and also even actually before that, popular publications. Things like slightly new age interpretations of the past and opening the door to what if they're wrong, or what if everything you thought you knew was wrong, and some political movements, borderline philosophies that seem to be intent on expanding that out to I mean, for example, we've seen recently, when a certain Mr. Potato Head was arrested in Romania, he tweeted out, "Oh, the Matrix have got me," which I think I mean, in that sense, that's also for various reasons, that's kind of disgusting that someone like him would use Matrix rhetoric to
they really missed the point of that movie, didn't they? They really,
and the directors and so on and so forth. But it is a slippery. That's the problem. It is a slippery slope. Once we start to, because as I said before, I'll return to genuinely my standpoint is, I'm more than happy for Hancock to be right, so long as there are shared points of comparison and standards of evidence. And in that sense, it'll be wonderful to be proven wrong. As you say, who wouldn't want to be involved in uncovering a globe-spanning, previously unknown civilization? It would be bloody amazing. I mean, who wouldn't want to have, but it has to have these shared points, these shared touchstones of reality, so that we actually can say to each other, this is why this is this and that is that. And once you start pouring at that, when you start clawing at this cloth, this shared fabric, well, we've seen what happens. I mean, we've seen a very dramatic example in the US not that long ago, and here in the UK, we've just gone through 3 prime ministers in a year because of people clawing at what were previously held common beliefs of public decency, conduct in public office, the need for people to prove what they are saying has merit is important. And so just to go off on a slight tangent, it reminds me of Terry Pratchett's The Hogfather, where towards the end of it, Death, who is filling in for a Santa Claus-like figure called the Hogfather, has his niece asking him, "Why are you doing this? The Hogfather's gone missing. Why do people have to believe in him? Why are you trying to keep belief in him alive?" And he says, "Well, because people practice by believing in small things in order to believe in big things. And so if you, for example, want to believe in truth, justice, love, all this sort of stuff, you need to start by maybe believing in Santa Claus, maybe believing in the Tooth Fairy. It gives you ideas or the notion that actually we can have shared truths and shared social contracts that start off in what are almost playful questions. And that can be inverted. It can be someone saying, well, what if actually these people over here didn't, or were always incapable of building this? Before you know it, you are, as you say, potentially, QAnoning it up and storming a government building in Washington. Ideas are crucial, and the common marketplace of ideas has to have a standard. Otherwise, it's chaotic. I mean, I'm rambling there, and I don't mean to be preaching to the converted. I mean, what did you guys have anything else to say about this?
Can I throw in? I said earlier I had a couple of sort of one-liners to finish with them before perhaps we give Bill the last word. I'd just like to throw those.
We've been building up to him. Oh God, no. That'll go in the edit. Top billing.
This is not fair. No, I'd like to chuck in just a last thought, and that is that perhaps when we're dealing with this kind of stuff, and okay, I would say this, wouldn't I? Because it's the currency of what I do these days. But sometimes you're best to deal with these subjects that impinge on archaeology, not as archaeology, but as cultural and media events and entities. And I'd just like to finish with a couple of short lines. One is this is from the Broadcasting Standards Commission's adjudication on the BBC's Atlantis Reborn, which was, as I say, that documentary that the BBC made about the Hancock and Beauval theories in 1999. They complained on a number of grounds. Only one of them was upheld on a minor issue of they held that the producers should have allowed more of a right of reply on one particular issue. Everything else was thrown out, including this. The complaint in Hancock's complaint is, quote, the programme had created the impression that he was an intellectual fraudster who had put forward half-baked theories and ideas in bad faith and that he was incompetent to defend his own arguments, end quote. The adjudication was, quote, the Commission finds no unfairness to Mr. Hancock in these matters.
Oh dear! And also, this commission was not archaeologists as well.
No, this was just a broadcasting ground.
In response, sounds about right.
Yeah, but and the other thing is, we're not dealing with anything particularly new here, as we've been saying throughout this conversation. Now, I've got a review of the program which I'm about to run in sort of conjunction in coordination with this video, and in the course of the research for that, I found a line which states basically it seems to state anyway Hancock's theory, Hancock's modus operandi, the way he works, as we got in that opening sequence in the Netflix series, quote, I admit it's a theory, a speculation. Except that wasn't said by Hancock. That was said in an interview to Richard Lingerman of the New York Times in 1974 by Eric von Daniken.
Yeah.
And I think that says a lot about that particular branch of pseudo-archaeology / public relations.
And also a caveat can't cover everything. What about you, Bill? What's your final word on this?
I think that I've been thinking a little bit about where we going forward. These debates pop up once every 6 months to a year as something new will pop up. I know the last one before this was also Atlantis based. It was the documentary about finding Atlantis, and it was these guys running around in boats and with using GPR incorrectly to try and find evidence of Atlantis, and that emerged and bubbled and then came back down again. And I do think this is a little different because Hancock is a unique figure and a much more convincing centerpiece than other pseudoscientists who have come up in recent years. And he's got some interesting quirks about him that make him more challenging to deal with. But I've been thinking about what do we do? I don't have an answer for this. The solution is I don't have a solution yet. But I'm thinking about it. What do we do in 6 months when this happens again? In a year when this happens again? In 10 years? Has there been a gradual erosion with each emergence of this stuff, and as it becomes easier and easier for these folks to get the word out there to huge audiences, is this going to continue to get worse and worse? And should it become the norm for archaeologists to get some media training or perhaps learn from journalists how to engage with these things? Because the techniques we've been using up until now have not been particularly effective. And I've learned a lot in the last couple of months. I had no idea what I was doing when first starting to engage with this. I still don't pretend like I do, but I've learned a lot in the last couple of months. So this is going to become a more normal part of our job as archaeologists, is to be media aware and know how to and when to engage, and perhaps when not to engage might be a possibility, right? So that's my call to action, I suppose, for archaeologists. At least get familiar with how we can do this effectively, how we can respond to these things effectively, when to respond and when not to respond. And I'm still learning as well. So if you've noticed I've made mistakes in the last few months, feel free to point them out, because I've got a lot to learn too.
which is something.
Can I? Well, actually, I know we said we would finish up and giving Bill the last word, but I one very, very quick point. And it comes from something Bill said in one of his videos, and I should have mentioned that very quickly. I think it's about archaeologists having conversations outside of archaeology as well, and access to archaeological material is a big part of that. There's a big debate going on in archaeology at the moment about journals of record and paywalls versus open access and so on. And Bill's pointed out in his videos that yes, people will happily send PDFs of papers. It shouldn't be like that.
Mm-hmm.
People should be able to access this stuff, not for $30 for an 8-page article.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, not entirely always for our own, it's not entirely our own fault sometimes, but sometimes also we're our own worst enemy when we're trying to deal with this stuff. But sorry, I just felt that maybe need to say.
I agree. But crucially, as I couldn't help but observe, that's something that you won't hear Hancock say is, correct me if I'm wrong, and I think that's, if nothing else, if you guys who just want archaeologists to have an open mind, I've seen that's the most benign version of the ancient apocalypse apologists argument that I've seen. Just have an open mind, guys. Why not? He's just asking questions. That's fine. But does he invite us to correct him? No. He just doesn't. If anything, he literally says they are wrong. I am right. I am the one. I am the. I am your.
Shall we have our own equivalent of? Shall we have our own equivalent of an Elon Twitter poll and ask our viewer if they think? Do guys out there, folks out there, do you think the Joe Rogan debate with Flint Dibble will happen?
Not whether it's good, but whether it will happen.
Wow.
I don't know.
I thought you were going to say, shall we say, I will abide by the results of this poll. Is archaeology wrong? And then just go. Only blue tick trowel members can vote on this.
And if we lose, then we'll just pretend like it never happened.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, to be fair, so I'm hoping. Possibly because he's currently trying to organise this debate on Joe Rogan. I'm interested to see if that goes ahead. But I am technically lined up, I think, at the end of the week to have it to film an interview with Flint. Actually,
brilliant. Okay.
But if he's not getting back to me, I know why, because he's busy doing this week. But I suppose the one thing I would say is from what I've seen of Joe Rogan's, especially his approach to Hancock, and also the fact that he appears in this series a couple of times, it's a mutually beneficial relationship. I think they have. I'm not sure the Joe Rogan experience is neutral territory.
No,
that's the best I could say.
Absolutely
not.
Sense,
No.
It's not. And Joe's more than just, I think, mutually beneficial with Graham. I'm using their first names as a sign of mild disrespect. In that I think that they are. I think Joe Rogan is a true believer. I think he is smitten with Hancock, and so even if he wanted to try and be a unbiased moderator, I don't know if he can, right? Because he's emotionally invested. He talks about Hancock like, "Oh, this guy's one of my heroes, and he opened my mind, he opened my eyes," and so he might be the kind of guy we were just talking about. As Joe Rogan has found himself embroiled with conspiracy theory and anti-vax stuff, and all this sort of things. And it's like, I don't know, has he gone down this path already that we're talking about? And part of that's because of the things that Graham has said. It's like, I don't see how it's in any way going to possibly be. Do I think Flint can still go in there and mop the floor with him? Maybe, right? Like, because he's just going to be prepared and he's a smart guy. But it's not going to be a fair fight. He's going to have an arm tied behind his back for sure. Not to keep using this like battle image. That's very cliche and patriarchal of me. But
the cut and thrust of debate, yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I mean, in that sense, I could talk about this forever. I'm sure Twitter will continue to talk about it for a good long time. Hopefully this has been interesting, folks at home. Please do comment below. Please do keep the comments respectful. as I say, there is room for plurality. There is room for different interpretations. There's room to discuss and debate. But my only guiding principle here, my desperate guiding principle, is a call for shared standards of proof and language and discussion, and also the willingness to be proven wrong. I've said it a couple of times in this recording. I'm happy to be proven wrong, if only there could be some adequate evidence presented. But ultimately, hopefully you've had fun. This has been a sort of review, sort of conversation, sort of debate, sort of therapy, I think, in a way. Thank you guys for your time. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Bill. Do check out Bill's channel. Follow him on Twitter. I'm sure he would very much welcome more abuse online. That'd be fantastic. But until next time, exactly. Yeah. All of us. Follow us all. Abuse us all. Until next time, guys. Do take care. Bye.
Bye.